Okay, folks, welcome. I don't even know, this is week 5. How's that even possible? But I guess, time just keeps moving along. So I thought today we would I got 3 things planned. One, and we could do these in any order we want to, is we'll take a look at this program, Miro, and just kind of goof around with it. Uh-oh, where'd my screen go? Oh, there it is. Okay, screen went dark, that was strange. So we'll try this program, Miro, and just goof around. I thought maybe we would map out. I know some of us have done our language mapping exercise already with the idea that we're mapping our languages to organizations. Oh, and then the lights turned off. And thing number 2 was a slideshow that just sort of recaps some of the primary issues in our readings thus far. And then I've got a series of questions and points in there. And then slideshow number 3 looks specifically at language documentation inspired by this week's reading. So I'm going to take a walk and get the lights to turn back on. Which one would you folks like to do first? Now that I have lights. Miro, documentation, or just an overview? Want to do the overview first? Okay. Hearing nothing, we'll go ahead. Oh, we gotta turn the TV on. So Jane is here to help keep the lights on. Yeesh.
Crazy guy by the carbon room.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me put this up here. So this set of slides I was calling Languages Now and Forever. So some of the things that we're really continuing to talk about are social change, language reclamation, and system development. Like developing a whole, we want to build movements. And I think a language program is great, but can fall apart. A language revitalization effort is great and should be done. And like a whole language movement is what we're looking for. So it would seem very difficult to nearly impossible for the whole thing to collapse. So one of the things that we said we'd talk about in here was the graded intergenerational disruption scale, called the GIDS. This was developed by Joshua Fishman, who is an important voice in language revitalization. I think Fishman, I'm trying to figure out where to put these. Hold on. I want the camera thing to go up to the top. There we go. So Joshua Fishman is someone who's really important in the field of sociolinguistics, and sort of said he developed this 8-point scale to say where you can grade where your language is currently at, with the idea that if you start getting towards the bottom, you can move your way back up to the top with strategies, language planning, language policy, language programs, and a language movement. So stage 1, X-ish would just be the language. So like fill in the blank with whatever language you are currently working in. So some use of X-ish in higher level education, occupational, governmental, and media efforts. So that means not that there are classes, but not that there are classes where you can learn the language, but there are classes using the language. That it's in the workplace, that it's in government. So are there city council meetings being held in the language? Are there dual language things like If a policy is passed within the state or federal government, is it written in the indigenous language? And in media efforts, is there a TV channel? Is there radio? Does the language exist at these sort of larger levels? Stage 2, Exish in lower governmental services and mass media, but not in higher spheres of either. So then you would see sort of, like, I guess the top one would mean that the state and federal government are doing things here. Like you might have some at the tribal council, some at other sort of the village councils, some in mass media, but not really a whole lot. It's just every now and then maybe there's a commercial or two that are totally in the language. Number 3 is use of Exish in the lower work sphere, outside of the Exish neighborhood, community involving interaction between X-men and Y-men, which is, I always thought this part was interesting. It always got me thinking of comic books whenever I got to number 3. But say you have a language, and that means the language is used among some people, but not really. I think what they're trying to get at here is you might have folks who are cleaning the ferry who speak the language, but it's not the captain who's speaking the language, and it's not the language of medium between everybody, but between certain populations. There might be some, you know, folks who know some of the language who are not ethnically tied to the language, but it's pretty, not too common. Number 4 is you have Exish in lower education that meets the requirements of compulsory education laws. So here, there's some sort of mandate that says the language will be taught at least in elementary school. One thing that's pretty common is when you get to middle school, high school, college, that you have less and less of non-English languages. That's the case typically in North America, with the exclusion of French. Stage 5 is you have Exish literacy in the home, school, and community, but without taking on extra communal reinforcement of such literacy. So what that's saying is that people can read in the language and write in the language, but there's no, it's not being taught anywhere where folks are required to know, to learn, to use it. Stage 6, the attainment of intergenerational informal oracy and its demographic concentration and institutional reinforcement. That means the language is not necessarily written and read, but it's still spoken very commonly, although nowhere is anyone saying that somebody has to or is encouraged to. Stage 7, most users of the language are socially integrated and ethno-linguistically active population, but they're beyond childbearing age. So they are all older parents, maybe grandparents. Those are the only true speakers of the language. And then stage 8, most users of the language are socially isolated old folks, and it needs to be reassembled from their mouths and memories. There could be a stage 9 where nobody speaks the language, but one of the things is sort of saying it goes from just among these isolated older people, that's the least healthy, and then the most healthy is it's used in education, it's used in the workforce, and it's used in government, and it's used in media. Any thoughts or questions about the GIDS?
Why is it called the intergenerational disruption scale?
Yeah, so intergenerational transmission is really what you want. You want to have a little kid and the parent and the grandparent, all three of them communicating to each other through the language. So disruption would mean that that has been, severed, it's been broken. So what you have there is, for example, I went to a community in Western Alaska, and I would say I saw somewhere probably around stage 4, where it was certainly in the school. We knew it was in the school. We knew a lot of people in the community could speak it. But one time when I went to the airport, I saw a grandma and the mother speaking to each other in the language. Then they would speak to the granddaughter in the language, and she would respond always in English. So I was thinking, now we're seeing this sort of disruption going on right there, because as she grows older, she may make the decision to primarily use English with her child, and then this is the sort of the way a language gets lost. So the intergenerational is sort of saying it needs to be present in the community in order to encourage the likelihood to happen that people will use it within their families.
Okay, I like that because it's like having standards for what a language community should be. Stage one is there's some disruption, and then in some cases it advances to stage 8 where there's too much disruption.
Yeah, yeah. And so he was sort of saying that you can figure out where you are and then you figure out what strategies. But basically, what I think a lot of Fishman was suggesting is if you're not number 8, you don't go for number 1, you go for number 7. If you're at 7, you go for 6. If you're at 6, you go for, and to really sort of try and build yourself up. Because a lot of folks who do this kind of work, sometimes they'll think, I don't even know where to begin. I don't know what the thing to do next is. But other folks, sometimes they'll say, okay, we just got to get it all back right now, tomorrow. And then uh, it was designed to sort of help see, and this comes out of work with the Hebrew language community, a language that was, for the most part, lost, was primarily a ceremonial language, was not used for a lot of day-to-day communications, and it was revitalized, it was brought back. And so there were pockets who were involved with that whole movement, which involved pockets of folks in North America and pockets of folks in Israel and other places. And so they tried to sort of share some of the things that were effective for them, and this is one of them. Any other thoughts? We'll take a look at another scale that was adapted from this one. So here's the expanded, the Egids, I guess you'd call it. So this is by M. Paul Lewis and Gary F. Simons, I believe it is. And so they also have numbers. So this goes numbers 0 through 10. Some of them have several steps. So you'll see here there's 8A, 8B. And then there's a term associated with the number, and then a description on the right. So here we go, where Fishman goes from stage 1 to 8, you go from stage 0 to stage 10. So stage 0, which is called international, which would mean the language is widely used between nations in trade, knowledge exchange, and international policy. So if your language is Dena'ina, when people come to Anchorage, are they expected to use the language in order to interact with you? Is there some sort of policy about language use when people come to your territory? Number 1, stage 1 is national. The language is used in education, work, mass media, and government at the national level. That would mean that it's a medium. So medium is a really key word for the work that we do. When we say language medium, that means that is the language used for that thing. So is that the language that we're teaching through? Is that the language we use when we work? Is that the language we use when we turn the TV or the radio on? Is that the primary language that is heard? And is government conducted in that language? So the answer would be yes if we were Greenland or certain parts of northern Canada, but the answer would be no, probably throughout all of Alaska. Stage 2 would be provincial. The language is used in education, work, mass media, and government within major administrative subdivisions of a nation. So the difference here, and these are kind of tough because we have 23 languages in one state, so it might not be something that we're looking at. I would say the difference probably, if we're Hawaii, that means uh, Hawaii was at number one before the U.S. government overthrew the kingdom of Hawaii. Because when you had Queen Ke'elikelani, she had a mansion, and then she had a house, a Hawaiian home, a hale, and when you went to see her, you conducted your business with her in Hawaiian, didn't matter where you're from. And so provincial would be more sort of, yes, that's the language that we use, but we also use English just as much, and when people come here, we switch to English to communicate with them. Step 3 is wider communication. So it's the language used in work and mass media without official status to transcend language differences across a region. So there's no official status, there's no national or statewide recognized language. There's nothing that says, and whenever we talk about these things too, there's two things to consider when it comes to a language policy. There's the overt and the covert. So the overt is what's written, what's clear. When you're here, please speak this language. And then the covert means it's the expected social thing. For example, I was listening to someone from my home community go on about watching someone who worked on the ferry and being upset that he wasn't working as hard as she thought he should be. And I was listening to this, getting a little uncomfortable, because she said, I took out a notebook and started writing down all the times and what he was doing. So he cleaned off the tables for a minute, then he sat down for 5 minutes. And then, I just thought it was really bizarre. But then she said, and then he turned to his friend and he started talking in a different language, and he's not supposed to do that because he's an employee of the state of Alaska. So now she's trying to take her expectations socially and make it into a law, and it's not a law. There's no law that says state employees have to speak English, as far as I know. So that's the difference between overt and covert, because sometimes you can get by with something being the social norm and what's expected, but other times you need to write down the law. Like, for example, if people were discriminating in your workplace because you're speaking Koyukon, then you need to have a law that says you cannot discriminate against people for speaking this language. Phase 4, or stage 4, is educational. The language is in vigorous use, with standardization and literature being sustained through a widespread system of institutionally supported education. So now you have written materials, you have standards, you have education through the language, you have a whole system. And this could be a dual language system. So I would probably say probably Hawaii, I would put them at this stage. They have, it may not, and maybe there's stages within the stages, because if you lived in certain communities, you might not have the option, but you could send your child potentially to a Hawaiian language medium school. Stage 5 is developing. The language is in vigorous use, with literature in a standardized form being used by some, though this is not yet widespread or sustainable. This would probably be Yupik, and perhaps St. Lawrence Island Yupik, where the language is there. And it wouldn't be the same for every single community, but if you just want to sort of rate where a language is, you still have use. You can get books printed entirely in Yupik. You can get whole stories. You can get that stuff in Yupik. There is some of that stuff in Tlingit, and the key for me would probably be vigorous use, which I'd probably say maybe not yet, but maybe trending in that direction. 6A, vigorous. The language is used for face-to-face communication by all generations, and the situation is sustainable. So I think one of the keys as you read through this one is, if you sort of read it from 10 to 0, you have to have those things in the higher number, lower stages before you could say you have that. So you can say, oh yeah, we've got vigorous use. Our people are so vigorous when they use the language. But then if you go down to 6 and it says used by all generations, and you say, okay, no, we're not there. We're just happen to be vigorous, right? Threatened, the language is used for face-to-face communication with all generations, but is losing users. And so again, the all generations thing is key. Is there a young child who uses the language? Not just who understands it, but who uses it for face-to-face communication. And that we might be down to 1 or 2 languages in Alaska. It's hard to say. 7, the childbearing generation can use the language among themselves, but it is not being transmitted to children. Moribund, the only generation of remaining active users of the language are members of the grandparent generation or older. 8b, nearly extinct. The only remaining users of the language are members of the grandparent generation or older who have little opportunity to use the language. Dormant. The language serves as a reminder of heritage identity for an ethnic community, but no one has more than symbolic proficiency. So it's used for ceremonies and cultural things, but no one can really speak in the language. And then you have 10, extinct. The language is no longer used, and no one retains a sense of ethnic identity associated with the language. So it does get a little sad as you get towards the end of this one. Does anyone have any thoughts on this scale? Kuching.
I did like looking at the second scale in comparison to the first, because I think with the first scale there were features of that the Tlingit language sort of had on most levels. So this one definitely gives a black and white, easier set of grade. But one thing I did like about the first list is that it gave sort of an insight as to what teaching methods lead to what stage. And so, we talk a lot about this program for one thing, maybe a family program, or this is a elder and youth program, or this is a generational program. I think that was really cool to see which methods should be used with which groups of people.
Yeah, right. Finish cheese. Yeah, and so some of these, kind of like the places the language is used and what it's being used for. I think that's what these scales hopefully get us thinking about, so we could say, okay, we're here. So if we're at shifting, how do we get to threatened? And if we're at threatened, how do we get to vigorous? And how do we keep climbing up? Any other thoughts? Suzu?
I know. So one of the things that I worry about as we get started, this one talks about usage and like dormant where, well, I'll just say that the ability to go back to it. So you mentioned Hebrew, and it was so well documented that they were able to go back to it. And my kind of panic moments are the fact that I thought we had a whole lot more written and documented and to fall back on to try to go learn independently. And I've compiled almost all of what we have in my own dialect into a place. And most of what those were are things that we're worried about getting lost, with the understanding that everybody's still speaking. And so when I was trying to learn basic stuff, I couldn't find it because they're so blah that you don't write. Like we don't write down how to say yes and how to say no. We don't write down the little things like, I don't know, the everyday terms until we stop and think to document them. So this is one, like in terms of this one right here that we're looking at, really clear for usage and doesn't necessarily address the how we can come back besides speaking. So just wanted to point out that because that's been a lot of where my worry is, because I thought we were in much better shape than we actually are.
Yeah.
On that side of it.
Koyana. So yes, so like a scale like this, it's like a plane that flies over and just looks down and says, okay, here's roughly where things are. So it does not show you like what kind of resources you have and need. It doesn't show you like, okay, people are talking, but what are their actual fluency levels? Is everybody, generally pretty low? And is it all just very basic levels of conversation? And so this is just one that sort of says, looking at the health of the overall language based on use, where could we place ourselves? And so that's really what this scale is for. And then I do remember, like, so we'll look at moribund, and nobody likes to sort of be, and it's not like a terminal diagnosis. Like, it's not like everybody calls you in the room and says, well, I hate to tell you, but you've been diagnosed as moribund, and start telling everybody your final wishes, right? And so sometimes when we read this stuff, that's kind of how we interpret it. Or sometimes people can get mad. So I've heard some folks say, well, they came in, they told us we were moribund, and they're never going to tell us that again. I'm like, okay, well, is that just because you said if you tell us that again, we're going to punch you in the throat? Or is it because we have changed things and now there's no way we could be that? The other things I've heard is sometimes people get really energized by seeing a handful of folks who can use the language. And that handful of folks bring a lot of energy and power, and just the way things can reverse can be very emotional and positive. But then sometimes you'll have someone stand up and say, I'm so glad that we are, I'm so glad that we're up here at number 2. It was basically what they're not using a scale like this, but they're saying, we almost lost it. I'm so glad we didn't. But the reality is there's like 6 people who can speak it. So, but also I do think you have to celebrate those accomplishments, but then sometimes visit things like this and figure out how, you might not ever get to 0. Like, I don't know. Like, Tlingit would have to become its own country, and then would have to have a national policy, and then, it's a nice thought, but I don't know if that's going to happen. But then the whole language would have to also be suddenly spoken. Like, let's say there's uh, maybe 80,000 people, 70,000 who live in Tlingit country altogether. And so if you got like 70,000 people, and then you got maybe 40 people who can speak the language, how on earth do you add 69,960 more speakers, right? And so, but those are things, but also sort of when you look at stuff like this, the other key is to not get discouraged, because maybe you're just trying to get to 3, or maybe you're just trying to get to 6A or something, and that's a huge step to move from being nearly extinct to a language used face to face by all generations. Any other thoughts? So go one more. So,
Oh, I
oh,
had a question. Who determines if you're a speaker or not?
that's a really good question. Uh, so what we'll look at maybe in some classes in the near future is how do we determine fluency levels. I think if it's someone who uses the language, then they're a speaker. I think that's all it comes down to. Are you using the language? Then you're a speaker. But then I think we also need to sort of figure out what are people's approximate levels, which can get some people upset. But it's sort of like if you need, I used to just program this stuff in my head. Like if I was trying to get certain types of language information, I knew who I could go and ask for those particular types of information. Because you might have a speaker who would tell you who knew all kinds of stuff, but they never want to talk about things like telling your kid to wipe their butt, or sometimes you had to talk about stuff that's embarrassing for some people. But as far as who determines who's a speaker, those are some things in the language community as well. Because I was in Hawaii where the language is vibrant and strong and coming back. There's millions of people on the islands of Hawaii, and there's maybe 10,000 people who speak Hawaiian. So again, you're looking at a very, very small percentage. However, these one folks were getting ready to do some things, and this guy came and talked to us. He's like, "You hang out with those guys?" Like, "Yeah, I hang out with those guys." And they said, "No, speak Hawaiian. I speak the real Hawaiian. The Kanaka, it's the real Hawaiian." I was like, "Oh, cool, cool, cool." And then later we went and told our, teachers. We said, "Yeah, that guy says he speaks the real Hawaiian, not what you guys talk. What do you think?" And they said, "He doesn't speak Hawaiian. He just knows some words." And so I asked them when I was over there. I said, "What happens to people here who learn Hawaiian but don't use it as a way to communicate with people?" And they said, "Well, they stop visiting with us. We don't tell them to leave, but we're just here using the language all the time." So I think it's good to celebrate who your speakers are. I think if a language is at a pretty low level, what if we made like some jackets and stuff that we could wear, a pin or something to recognize where folks are at? Because sometimes this stuff, are you a speaker or not, gets really tied up into complex issues of identity, which for Indigenous peoples is often legislated to us anyways. So then it becomes this other thing. Like sometimes I feel like, oh, well, here's my Clinton Haida card, and here's my BIA card, and here's my ANCSA shares. Oh, and here's my fluent speaker card, which I feel like we want to be in this situation where we're not gatekeeping ourselves, but also we're being realistic about the work it takes and how we get from here to here, and also how we celebrate getting from here to here. That's a good question. Those are my thoughts. Anyone else have thoughts on it? When I started teaching Tlingit, people would ask me that quite a bit. They'd say, "Are you fluent?" That's usually what they would say to me. They'd say, because I'd say, "Oh, I teach Tlingit." They say, "Oh, you're fluent?" And I'd say, "Well, I could speak it. I don't know, But I do think we will talk about assessments and fluency. And what's interesting is there's a lot of programs that do assessments and that do fluency, but I think language assessments at that, like using the ACTFL scale, the American Council of Teachers of Foreign Languages, it kind of works for people who don't know the language and learn it, but it doesn't really work for if you built a program and kids grow up in the language. So Nora Marks Dowenhauer and Richard Dowenhauer did some work as well on this idea of using a chart. They also have an 8-point scale for Tlingit, and so this was what they proposed. And they call it steps in reversing language shift, severity of intergenerational dislocation. So one of the key differences is they talk about trying to attain diglossia. So diglossia is where let's say there's a group of people, and then there's a language that's spoken, but is seen as sort of the lower class, lower economic scale of folks. Like the poor people's language is basically what it's seen as. And then you have a language of wider use and of higher status. So sometimes this is the case for languages in certain places. So their theory says you try to attain diglossia, so you have basically a population of speakers and a population of non-speakers, and then you try to transcend diglossia. But the term diglossia means the language is spoken, but it's seen as a lower status thing. So they say, going steps 1 through 8, so they do take a different approach where the higher the number, the higher the health of the language. So if we looked at the other scales, if you're at stage 8, you're in trouble. If you're at stage 10, you're in big trouble. Now this one, if you're at stage 8, you're doing great. So they say their steps are to reconstruct Tlingit and adult acquisition of Tlingit as a second language. So that's what they considered step one, which is basically adult acquisition. We got to get adults to speak the language, which has been going on here for quite some time. Step two, cultural interaction in Tlingit, primarily involving the community-based older generation. So I think that has lessened. So if you go to cultural ceremonies among Tlingit people, I think you hear a lot less Tlingit than you did 10 years ago. I think the language is used less and less in the cultural atmosphere. But that's what they say, step two. Step three would be intergenerational and demographically concentrated home, family, neighborhood, the basis of mother tongue transmission. So for them, I think stage three would be maybe even having these clusters of homes with speakers who are living next to each other and who are using the language. This is a model that I believe has worked in with Welsh and with Gaelic language in Ireland. And so basically you're trying to create these homes where the language is used, but they're pretty isolated. Stage four, schools for literary acquisition for the old and the young, and not in lieu of compulsory education. So we do have this with the TCLL program, with the language nest, with the Haida language nest. You have this in Heidelberg, but it's not the mandatory education. It's saying there's this optional program, but there's a school. So then for them, step five, schools in lieu of compulsory education and substantially under Tlingit curricular and staffing control. So here would be a K through 12 school that was entirely in Tlingit and was a legal option for graduating high school. 5B would be public schools for Tlingit children offering some instruction via Tlingit but substantially under Anglo-American curricular and staffing control. Oh, I guess number 5 would be primarily a cultural school. And then 5B, I guess they go together. 5B would mean that in all public schools, there's some, on Tlingit land, there is some Tlingit that's being taught. Stage 6 would be the local regional work sphere, both among Tlingit and among non-Tlingit. So that means in the workplace, you're going to hear Tlingit being used on a regular basis, regardless of people's ethnic background. Stage 7, local regional mass media and government services, again in the language. Stage 8, education, work sphere, mass media, and government operations at higher and nationwide levels. So then again, in 8, it becomes a global language. And so any thoughts on any of those scales?
How do those scales compare to the UNESCO scale for endangerment? Or do they have different purposes?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's go look at UNESCO. Oh, I have that somewhere too.
I have it up. I can paste it in the chat. I was just looking at it because the scales reminded me of it.
Uh-huh. So here they have a 5-point scale is what I see. Let me know if, let me try that one too. So the language is used by all ages from children up. That's safe. Unsafe, the language is used by some children in all domains. It is used by all children in limited domains. So again, domain is a physical or social space for the language, or just physical or social space. Definitively endangered, the language is used mostly by the parental generation and up. Severely endangered, The language is used mostly by the grandparental generation and up. Critically endangered, the language is used mostly by very few speakers of the great-grandparental generation and extinct with no speakers. So it seems like their focus is on the generational use, where I think the GIDS also factors in like social spheres as well. That's probably the primary difference. And also sort of, and sometimes it's good to sort of have it in this sort, it's a 6-point scale, really, 0 through 5, as opposed to like an 11-point scale, or I think the expanded GIDS is even 13 or 14. Good question. Anything else?
I kind of have a little uh question. So in this one that's on the screen right now, and then the first one, they mention the language being used by primarily a certain generation and above, the grandparent generation. But what about like my mind keeps thinking about Hugkill. A lot of grandparents' generation right now don't speak it, and the few speakers that are left, I mean, we only have a few speakers left. And now I would say more of the childbearing age and the younger generations are the ones learning and using it more so than the grandparents' generation and up. So I think I had a little bit more hard time with the first and last chart you showed, but this middle one right here, I really agreed with Kuchain also. I could relate more to this one, I think.
Right, because one thing to remember is like what you see in Hawaii in particular, and probably in other areas as well, was it was a childbearing, like the population who started to learn how to speak in their late teens and 20s, who had children and then talk to those children in the language. That's what fueled this whole generational shift. So maybe there is something that's missing in all of this, which is you can transform this, but what is the process? And then what do you do with the sort of, you have a bit of a set of lost generations as well, where you have this population that didn't, when they were growing up, these programs just didn't exist. And when they were growing up, there was probably a lot more in your face anti-Indigenous racism. Like, I've certainly experienced my fair share, but it's probably pretty mild compared to what my parents grew up with. But also, the other things that aren't on here is these are numbers and sort of situations, but also the various ruptures that exist within individuals and families. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is there's someone that I know, and when we see each other, we speak the Tlingit language all the time. We're just excited to speak the language to each other, and that's our primary mode of communicating. We don't always give a whole lot of thought to who is around us, not to be rude, but we just sort of, we can speak, so when we see each other, we speak. And so one time we're in a car with two other people who were a generation above us, like they could have easily been perhaps our parents. They might have been a little young when they had us, if they were our parents, but they were certainly a generation above us. And we were speaking to each other in the language, and then we're in the back seat of a car, and they're in the front seat of the car. And so in the front seat of the car, one of them turns to the other and said, in the full way, there they effing go again. And we're obviously upset that we were speaking to each other in the language, even though everybody in the vehicle was ethnically Tlingit, among other things. But so there's also those sorts of things which are, they're not on a scale like this. It's not as simple as sort of like, oh, you just get people talking and then you start using it here, then you start using it there. You actually have a lot of these ruptures, which are huge and which are sometimes really difficult to overcome, because then also there are situations like this. I'll tell a little story. So someone I talked to was telling me, well, and here's someone else who's old enough to be my parent. He says, well, my older sisters are quite a bit older than me and my brother. But in between the time the sisters were born and the brothers, the family decided to stop speaking the language and to prohibit all family members from speaking to the children in the language. So it was an active in-family prohibition, probably quite common. So one day, the mother and father are in the kitchen and call this person in. He's a young boy. And they said, come into the kitchen, we want to talk to you. And his mother starts giving him directions. Go make me some coffee and make me some toast. And butter the toast, put jam on it. You know, I like a little bit of sugar and a little bit of canned milk. Put a little canned milk in that coffee. Now come over here and sit down, we want to talk to you. So that's what she says. So after she says this and he does everything he's told and he sits down, the mother says, I thought I told your grandfather to stop speaking to you in our language. And the boy says, oh, he doesn't. And she says, well, how come I said everything in our language to you and you understood it all? And he said, no, that was English. And then the father says, no, that was Tlingit. So the mother says, go get your grandpa, tell him to come down here. So he takes a long walk up to grandpa's place and says, Mom wants to talk to you. She's really mad because you've been talking to me in Tlingit. And he says, you're not supposed to tell her. I told you don't tell her. And he says, I didn't. They were just talking to me in Tlingit and I didn't even realize it. I could just understand it. So they had a big family meeting. It took a long time. And the grandfather never spoke to the grandchild again in Tlingit. And the person who told me that story said, I still am angry at my mother to this day, and I don't know how to deal with it. When I start to learn the language, all that anger comes back. Then you got all this other shame and all this other stuff. But still, I think sometimes a step-by-step process does help, but it's almost like we got to have this trauma overcoming and diagnosis thing as well, or else we're going to hurt each other too if we're not careful about the work that we do and how we go about it. Other thoughts? That was a lot. So thinking of this stuff, some of the things I think about are capacity. Like when you think about your language program, consider the following. What would it look like to have a safe space for your language? What do you have that is leading to that? What do you need in order to get there? And how do you get what you need? Does anybody want to answer any of these 4 questions?
I think like to create a safe space for language, you first need to say this is a safe space, that we're not going to judge you, we're not going to laugh at you for trying. Whenever you're ready, you can try. And then like another way is to have all the resources for everyone and not just for like one person, the teacher. And what do you have leading to that? I think that would also be like in the Juno Shemalia learners group, to have that everybody is invited. Like it doesn't matter if your mother's not Tsimshian or you don't have a clan, that everyone is welcome. So I think that's a good way to start.
Anyone else have thoughts on these?
I'll share some thoughts. I've been trying to look at how, and I'm finally actually taking steps. So as of Friday night, I sent out an invitation, Inupiaq, Let's Speak Inupiaq, on Facebook. I sent it to staff and just say, we'll take 30 minutes to just learn, practice, use. And some of the things that I had been working up towards in between, I think what really helps is to have ways to reframe our issues and concerns, which are all valid and hit us hard all the time, in a way that shows that we can acknowledge those concerns and still look at how we're moving forward. So, for example, as one of the things that we worry about is how we will pronounce and how right or wrong we are and being corrected on which dialect we're using. And one of the things that I've come to help reframe is, instead of talking about accuracy and pronunciation, I talk about accent. And I say, we're all gonna have a thick English accent when we start. And it isn't until we start to use it that our Inupiaq accent will start to come out. And sometimes it won't, some of us won't get there. Our thick accent will always remain. And some of us, it will lessen over time. And some of us will have an easier time to start. So it's okay to have an accent. And so reframing, pronouncing it wrong to having an accent. And another one in terms of that I had been struggling with is I work with teachers. And so, I mean, that's my job, that's what I do. And so I realized that a lot of what when I get to offer a training, it's with our transplanted residents. It's the people who have moved here. It's not necessarily going to be the people with the same heritage. And it feels unfair to give them the first shot to learn some language. And so when we look at so one of the things that we've built in to address that is, we're going to make sure that some of our core might be those born and raised, that's kind of where some of our concern and why we end up limiting who gets to come and learn first. And so by reframing it so that, one, I pay attention to who gets opportunities. And if I want everybody to get the opportunity, that I'm clear and upfront and make sure that I communicate to all sides. And I don't only send something to staff, that I actually put it on Facebook first. I mean, these little things and knowing and understanding the dynamics, because we're facing them, even though it might take us a long time to understand why something feels wrong, being able to do it and reframe it so that it is inclusive and embracing and without being apologetic, that we can actually not feel like we're making excuses, but reframing it in the same concern in a positive. And so those are, I feel like after this is my 4th year in this job, I've been studying for a long time, and I always would not do something because I don't want to do it wrong. And even when I was saying that, as soon as I would work up the courage to try something, it didn't necessarily take off. And so always communicating those underlying principles of we got to start somewhere, and our accent will improve over time, giving permission, giving a safe face permission to be willing to be there. And even in the accuracy and saying it wrong, to reframe it that communicating is more important than precision right now. And so if I say something in a broken Inupiaq, if you understand what I'm trying to get at, like I used to still, like I'm really forcing myself right now not to apologize for how I put it together. I gotta tell myself, it's okay. They'll fluently correct me because nobody's correcting me. They're just saying, I understood you. And part of it was before I speak, is to actually say, I hope what I mean is coming out in the way. I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say. And usually after I dialogue and script out what I'm going to write, when I'm done, I'll say, And for those of you that don't understand, what I hope I just said is this. But kind of I give everybody else permission to, oh, yep, she's learning and yay, we're gonna support that instead of, how come she's talking like that? And the people gonna think that's how we say it. You know, we give the permission, whether ahead of time or in after, to acknowledge all of the concerns we have and show that, yeah, we're still moving forward, and yeah, we can accept this in between version of it so far. So thanks for listening.
Hoyana. Yeah, I mean, it's real easy to sort of paralyze yourself, and then maybe I might regret it, but I'll show you folks something I made over the weekend. I want to talk about this for a second. Let me find it first. So I was thinking of this. I make little cartoons now and then, and I do make fun of the fields of linguistics at time and anthropology at times, and so I took this found a little picture from the film Dances with Wolves, which when it came out in the early 90s was kind of a groundbreaking film, just the way it humanized indigenous peoples, and they had a character who learned an indigenous language, and I came to critique it later as I talked with other indigenous folks about it's a story of kind of two white people who fall in love in the backdrop of Native Americans who are all getting killed off, which I think you can argue is also a theme in important films such as Wind River, which came out a few years ago. So anyways, so it's a little comic, and he says, we are linguists, we come with expertise. My name is Corrects with a Fist, and this is claims the language as her own. And we'll just sort of leave it at that, because it's not all the time, but it does happen. Where, uh-oh. They turn the lights out on me, they've had enough. Where people come in to do some work in your communities, and then sometimes end up becoming the experts. And then sometimes there's a bit of a violence in terms of the indigenous peoples then becoming the experts themselves. And even having expertise in some of these ideas of what it takes to teach and to run a program, I think can be colored by a lot of this stuff. Like I teach Tlingit, and I have taught it for over 10 years at the university. And there's every day I barely know what I'm doing and what I'm going to do next. But my goal is to just keep this group of people going and to believe in themselves and to make it a language of use and to sort of try and demystify the ways we can sort of build up a language within human beings. And sometimes my experiences have led me to people who are pretty rude about the ways that they communicate with people. Writing feedback on things wrong in capital letters with a big exclamation point. And I'm just like, what are you doing here? And then also just sort of who's in control of the language program, and how is it going to develop, and how is it going to be strong enough and also flexible enough to go through some systemic changes that it might need to go through at times? What if you have one person who's doing so much stuff and something happens to them, or they leave, or if it's all built upon this whole set of elders, and how is your program transitioning itself for when you do lose that generation of elders who are speakers? And these are things that are difficult, and there's no easy way to sort of look at what the stages are. And again, coming back to the GIDS, there's also maybe stages of program development, which I think is not as clearly mapped out. Like, where do you start? What do you do? What resources do you have? And what do you need? And how do you keep track of all that stuff? And when you get these organizations involved, how do you make sure they're all sort of moving in a way that sort of makes sense? Because you might have this organization and this organization, and collectively they could bring in millions of dollars. But then this person who leads that organization hates this person who leads this other organization. So you can never have them in the same room. You got to talk to this person, then leave, then go talk to this person, leave, and then figure out what to do. So there's a lot. No matter which language you're looking at, there's a lot in terms of either keeping it stable, bringing it back to use, or trying to, keep it from getting lost. And all of those things require like a great deal of concerted effort, but also just sort of looking at other models and just trying to figure out like how on earth did they do that, and how do we do the same thing here? Because a lot of times as well, you're going to get federal funding, you might get private funding, you might get state funding, and you might get other sources of funding. But then if you sign an agreement, then you got to sort of play by the rules of whoever is funding the thing as well. And also you have to figure out who is going to manage the grants and manage the programs, and who's going to develop the curriculum, and who's going to make the teachers, and who's going to teach the kids, and who's going to teach the adults. So you got to also have these sort of systems of putting all this stuff together, which maybe leads us to this and other things like it. So this is Miro. It's a pretty neat program. It's stuff you can do a lot sort of on your own. You could do a lot with a team of people. So I think, let me see, let me try something. So if I copy this link and then I put it into the chat, we're just going to test this out a little bit. So if you can, if you're online, click on that link and tell me what happens. Tell me where it takes you to. You shouldn't have to create anything. You should be able to just be on there as a guest, which, if you have a whole team of people, ideally, maybe everybody has their name and stuff like that. But you shouldn't have to sign up for anything as far as I know. But what happens when you click that link? It's in the chat.
It's asking me to sign in, and I have an option to put my email address or sign in with Google.
Let me try it as well. I'll use a. Oh yeah, I guess you do. I'll try it with Google. I'll see what happens.
I tried with Google and selected my university account, and it worked.
Okay, yeah, so I was able to do that as well. Oops. Now what happened?
Mine went right to what you got.
What's that?
Mine went to what you have on the shared screen. I think I'm logged in with my university account. Yeah.
Yeah, I see some people moving around. So
I did like you before sign up for the Miro, because we can get it for free as with the .edu account.
yeah, you should be able to use your university account. And then it might be new for some of us, so we're just gonna sort of goof around. There's nothing we're gonna mess up. There's nothing we're gonna erase that's critical. This is just a template board to goof around with. But so on the left, wherever your tools are, there's a number of tools. There's a select tool. So if I click the select tool, now I can grab stuff and drag it around. I can take these things and relink it over here. So basically the select tool is how you sort of grab things and move them around. We're not going to worry about the templates. I can add text to different places. So I could type something here. There's something important. And I can mess around with that, and I could make it probably bigger. I could probably do some different stuff with it. So you can add text. I could make it bold, maybe. And then underneath that is the sticky note, which is probably one of the more useful things. So if I click on the sticky note, I can now pick a color. So I'll grab a green one, and I'll click over here, and I can adjust the size of this little note, and I could put something in here like a language. So here's a language, and then I want to grab another one. I'll grab a red one, and I'll call this a funder. So it looks like it kind of remembers the size of the notes that you're using. And then I can use the arrow key down here and grab an arrow, and I go like that. And there's probably another type of arrow I could use to go like that. So there's a bunch of different little drawing tools. So we don't have any sort of assigned task just yet. Just mess around, put some things on there. If you don't like it, you can select it and probably delete it. No? Is that arrow just there forever? Okay, there it is. You can also use the shapes to sort of build a board. So maybe these are particular things. And then I can give this a color. I'll make it orange, a little bit see-through. And then I should be able to right-click and select send to back. So this goes behind these things. Put up the chat. Oh, there's a zoom map. Okay. Great. It looks like folks can get in. There's someone's adding a star. Nice. Let's see, what is this? I think I have a highlighter. And highlight something. Yeah, I like that. So some of the things you could do with a program like this is start to sort of map some of this stuff out. So I could have a board that says short-term goals. I have a board that says medium, and I have a board that says long. And then I could even divide those into separate boards to have the micro, the macro, and the meso if I wanted to. So sometimes there's these phases you go through in terms of project planning. Like say, we're starting a canoe club here for students on the UAS campus. So if we said, okay, what are our goals? Our goals right now are to make model canoes, and our goals in the medium term is to sort of find some funding and figure out how we're going to make one canoe. And then our long range goal is to probably have a fleet of canoes and ways to store them and paddles and workshops. So sometimes you're using a program like this to build yourself up into what kinds of things you're going to do. So you might be sitting in the middle of your brainstorming activity. And so you might sort of be figuring out like let's just take this. So I'm on this orange one right here. So let's say this was, whoops. Let's say I just make a new one. I'll set it right. Whoops, that's not what I want to do. Okay, there it is. So I'm going to make this orange one here, and I'm going to call this fundraising. So here, like I know I need to raise money for this language program, so then I might sort of pick a different color and say, so I'm going to go for what I'm going to call state. Well, let's go federal grants. So we're going to do federal grants for my language program. And so this all goes under fundraising. And then I could select this, copy it, paste it. And I'm also going to do state grants. And then as we brainstorm other funding sources, there's going to be private grants, and then there's also going to be private donors. And then when you get in, so it's sort of seeing how these things connect. And part of this work is sort of saying who is here and who is going to do the thing, right? So maybe the state grants and the federal grants are kind of similar to each other. So we have one person that we assign to take care of those. The private grants are a bit different. So this is like Rasmussen Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Luce Foundation. So these are large agencies that can give money. Private donors are going to be individuals. So how many millionaires live in Southeast Alaska? But it's not just the millionaires too. Like I went to this workshop years ago and they said, yes, people think about state grants, federal grants, private grants, and then also these, trying to find these massive donors, like this dream that some billionaire is going to come and fund your language program. But there's also just sort of, can you get people to just give $5? Right? Like, and so like sometimes in your act of fundraising, the things that have to go here as well is like, what are the obligations to these? Because for these, you might have a group like the First Nations um, Development Institute who could say, okay, here's 100 grand. Just go be you. Go be awesome. Go do the thing. But a federal grant, you might now have to report quarterly on what you do, how much money you spent, where the money went, what you bought, what are the deliverables. It's pretty common in a language movement for someone who's a learner, speaker, user of the language to get sucked into the grant management world, and they're always trying to keep the grant, write the next grant, figure out what to do with the funding and how to move the money around and how to keep people hired and happy. So in addition, you might have a whole other board that's sort of taking care of some of these. What are your resources and who's doing what? And so some of these things I think are really helpful, especially if you can develop a process of harvesting information, not trying to organize it yet, even though I just showed you, and I was just moving stuff around, but really just sort of, let's get as many ideas on the board as we can. So let's say we all worked for one collective language. We might say, okay, what should we do this year? What should we do? Or what should we do all together? Not even just thinking this year. And don't think about only what's possible. Like dream the impossible dream. Go ahead. And then everybody just put up a sticky board. You put up these little sticky notes all you want. And then have a time period where you sort of wrap that up at some point. And okay, we're gonna do 20 minutes, just put as many ideas up as you can. Feel free to take a break if you need to. But at the end of that 20 minutes, and there's little timers on here, like so I can, let's see where to go. I think it's down here, I can't see it. So I could put I'll give you a 5-minute timer. So here's your task. Even though this board is getting messy, we're just messing around, learning how to use this thing. Grab some sticky notes, and I want you to put down as many ideas as you can. What should a language program do? I'll give you 5 minutes. Do you see a timer on your end?
Yeah.
What's that?
I didn't think I could snag.
Oh, yeah. And if you We got 1 minute left. Okay, that's time's up marker. I guess I could have even picked music. What happens when I do that? Oh, here's a sunshine jam. Okay, I didn't share my screen. So some of the things you could do, and I think like thinking about the planning process for whatever your organization is, and maybe this is something kind of small, like it's a language program within an entity. Maybe this is something pretty big. Like let's say if you have Inupiaq, like that's lots of organizations, lots of communities, lots of people. So but sometimes it's good to have that large reach, and sometimes it's good to have that smaller reach. I do think, and we're just messing around here, but I think if you come in, one is like, how do you get people to be relaxed enough to be free thinkers? So one, like, I don't want people to think about, well, we can't do that, or maybe if we get this thing, then we could do that thing. But instead, you sort of have just this wide open brainstorm. Just go, do stuff, think about stuff. Then maybe you have a team who's sort of, it's good to have like at least 2 people who are facilitating and planning event. So then maybe that team sort of says, okay, we're going to go and we're going to start putting this stuff into, we're not going to change anything, we're not going to delete anything, but we're just going to take these little sticky notes and say, oh yeah, so when we're talking about databases, we're talking about like a corpus thing. This is the language, the words of the, and then we got fundraising, so we're going to put the fundraising with the fundraising stuff. And so we might sort of say, okay, nobody touch the board. We're going to just organize it. We're going to take an hour. You guys all go have lunch, have fun, come back, and we'll look at it organized. And then I'll show you folks some stuff on this as well. You can vote on things. You could do stuff like that. Always give yourself a nice separation between the free form, open, no limitations brainstorm and the editorial phase. So you could come in and say, okay, now we got to figure out what we're doing because we can't do everything, but we got to figure out like, and then we start to sort of stage things. And these can be sometimes sensitive discussions. Someone might have this wonderful idea, right? But then maybe they're just stuck on this idea and the rest of the group thinks, that's really cool, but I think we need to do this thing before that thing. And so sometimes you got to engage in some of those conversations. And tools like this, it's just a tool. It's just something that's there to help you. Uh, and we'll try some guided exercises using this again, where we have a specific task and we start to say, okay, let's build this kind of entity, or let's figure out what these activities are going to be. But that's all the time we got for today. Before we go, who is talking about TPR on Wednesday? Total physical response. Heather?
No, you.
Okay.
I volunteer as tribute.
Okay, so
No, also I volunteered, right? But
so the 3 of you, are you in touch with each other at all?
Hmm?
Was that a yes or no?
psych.
Okay. So do you folks want to touch base with each other? It's nothing really that formal. Here's what I'm hoping. You're going to find as much stuff about total physical response as you can and just figure out how to lead us through about a 30 to 45-minute conversation. Not like you have to give us that much material, but for everybody in this class, go find as much out as you can about total physical response, TPR. And we're going to talk about it on Wednesday, and we'll all be here, we'll all be contributing, but we have 3 group leaders who are going to sort of, basically when the class starts, I'll say, take it away. And you folks will lead us through a discussion. I'll try to be a little more quiet than I usually am. And I'm not expecting you to give us the full-on 90-minute seminar on what exactly TPR is, and we'll all be masters of it by the end. I just want you to show us what you could find and to sort of think about these things. What is it? What can we do with it? What are its limitations? And how does it become, how do we sort of put it into our box of tools? Those are the things I'm thinking of. I'm not expecting anybody to be an expert on it. There's not any grade associated with what kinds of materials you present. It's just a chance, 1, to go find some stuff out about something. 2, to pluralize the voices that are in the classroom, just so I can see what other folks are talking about. And then 3, just to sort of have a chance to sort of lead folks through some stuff. Are there any questions? Do folks need anything?
Link to the Google sheet. I was looking for it and I couldn't find it.
Funny story. I didn't know what Nuea's English name was. I don't know who I emailed. I'm sorry if I emailed the wrong person. I was just guessing on your English name.
You emailed me, Kachin. I was worried that I had
Oh,
volunteered. I was worried I had volunteered and I was way behind and I lost.
I'm my English name is Austin.
So that takes some stress off of my back. I was real worried.
I thought there was a different sheet that had names already on there.
I don't think
Maybe
so.
that's where it got flat.
I think I ever got that organized. Okay, folks. So you TPR folks are you're the tone setters for the upcoming presentations. But really, it's not even a presentation. You're really just helping to guide a discussion on a particular method. And then we'll continue this talk with, well, we'll probably, after we're done talking about TPR, however long it takes, Wednesday we'll also talk about language documentation. And then I've got a few other sort of, and some of the questions that I was asking in the other slideshow are semester-long topics for us to consider. Okay, thanks everybody. See you on Wednesday.